Section 3. How not to fix climate change. Chapter 6. You can't fix climate change. Around the planet, well-meaning people are making a myriad of lifestyle changes to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions. Individuals and companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars annually on carbon offsets and other measures. Taxpayers are, through regulation and subsidies, collectively spending hundreds of billions of dollars annually to encourage the use of today's alternative energy technologies, such as electric cars and solar panels. Soon, we will start spending trillions or even tens of trillions of dollars every year in an effort to convert the modern economy to green energy sources. Yet all of these efforts are failing. If climate policies worked, then the amount of carbon dioxide we emit for every unit of energy produced, so-called carbon intensity, should be declining, but it is not. Despite dozens of climate summits and despite global climate agreements struck in Kyoto and Paris, carbon intensity has increased ever since nations first made commitments to rein in climate change at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Carbon intensity is at a higher level than ever before. Footnote 1. Carbon intensity is, estimating the global carbon intensity 1966 through 2017 from IEA 2019D using total primary energy supply for all energy. End footnote. Not only does each unit of energy emit ever more carbon dioxide, but the world also uses more and more energy. As a result, total carbon emissions keep rising. Since 1992, humanity has emitted more carbon dioxide than in all history before them. Emissions will likely keep increasing in the coming decades as more poor countries clamber out of poverty. Footnote 2. Since 1992, humanity. Using data from H. Ritchie and Roser, 2019a, Global Carbon Project, 2019a. The last decade has seen more focus on climate change than ever before. Yet despite this, we are not achieving anything. In a surprisingly honest review of climate policies, the United Nations revealed that the last decade of climate policies has achieved a sum total of nothing. Okay, there's another. I'm going to stop doing footnotes because they're not doing more than citing their sources. Let's just say there are many sources for what he's saying. It's clear that the current approach to climate change is not working. But before talking about what we should do instead, we first need to understand why we're failing. Over the next 5 chapters, we will explore why our current efforts achieve so little. We'll begin with the first great myth of climate activism, that individuals can make a significant difference. If you're concerned about global warming, and really, who isn't, you know that you should probably recycle, eat less meat, or maybe none at all, take public transportation more and drive less, and carry your groceries in recyclable bags. As Blue Planet host David Attenborough puts it, every single one of the planet's 7 billion inhabitants must play their part against global warming and take simple, everyday actions. We live in a world where Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, are castigated for flying on private planes, while Swedish activist Greta Thunberg is hailed for taking a wind and solar-powered boat from Europe to New York to attend a climate conference. She was later subjected to sneering headlines when it turned out the trip increased carbon emissions because crew needed to fly to New York to sail it back. The personal has become highly political. People are worried about climate change and they want to help solve the problem. The intentions are noble ones. The problem is that the changes we can make to our personal lifestyle and habits, at best, make only a tiny difference. Asked what personal action he would take to prevent global warming, David Attenborough once promised to unplug his mobile phone charger when not in use. The logic makes sense. He would save on electricity, which is mostly fossil fuel powered. But if he remembers to do this consistently throughout the entire year, he will cut just 7 pounds of CO2 each year, less than half of 1,000th of the average emissions for a single person from the United Kingdom. And if the goal is to reduce the emissions caused by a mobile phone, focusing on this trivial personal action means we miss the bigger picture. Charging makes up less than 1% of a phone's energy needs. The other 99% comes from manufacturing the phone and operating data centers and cell towers. 7 pounds of carbon dioxide per year is hard to comprehend. One simple way that we can get a sense of the scale of the effect of different cuts is by using the carbon trading system. The RGGI, or RGGI, is a carbon trading marketplace covering the northeastern United States. It is just one of many around the world, but the first and biggest in the US. The RGGI puts a cap on the amount of carbon dioxide that large fossil fuel-run power plants can emit in the region. Then it allows emittance authorizations to be bought and sold. It costs about $6 to buy an authorization for 1 ton of carbon dioxide. If you buy an authorization, it means there's 1 ton less that power plants can purchase. If you don't use the authorization, that means all the power plants, between them, need to find a way to emit 1 ton less over the next year. Essentially, you've spent $6 and reduced global emissions by 1 ton. The RGGI puts the actions of individuals in perspective. It gives us a sense, for instance, of the scale of the impact of Attenborough's promise. Cutting 7 pounds of carbon dioxide would cost a little less than 2 cents on the RGGI. Attenborough might as well have just donated 2 cents to the climate cause. Sadly, the vast majority of the actions individuals can take in service of reducing emissions, and certainly all those that are achievable without entirely disrupting everyday life, will make little practical difference. That's true even if all of us do them. The UK's former chief climate science advisor, the late David Mackay, once wrote of carbon cutting effects, "Don't be distracted by the myth that every little helps. If everyone does a little, we'll achieve only a little." 3 central challenges emerge when we try to cut our personal emissions. The first, as we saw in the case of Attenborough's mobile phone, is that cuts are typically small. The second is that we almost always save money. This is a problem because of a well-established phenomenon called the rebound effect. When we save some cash by being more efficient, we spend the savings elsewhere in ways that lead to more emissions. Let's take the example of reducing food waste. In theory, if we reduce the amount of food we buy, less food will need to be produced, which will reduce agricultural emissions. But it will also have the happy effect of saving us money. The problem is that we will spend that money on other things, many of which will produce emissions, like an extra vacation. In one 2018 study, Norwegian researchers found that realistically, the money saved from cutting food waste will be spent on other goods that will emit so much carbon dioxide that the original emissions savings will be entirely canceled. In many cases, the rebound effect doesn't swamp the entire effort. Carpooling, for example, will actually reduce emissions, with the cost savings leading only to 32% of the reduction being lost. Sometimes, however, the rebound effect leaves us worse off overall. For instance, walking instead of taking the train means we emit much more carbon dioxide because trains aren't big emitters and we save a lot of money that we spend on other things. Generally, when researchers have studied the rebound effect across a range of activities, they estimate that 59% of the emissions savings from virtuous behaviors are lost to the rebound effect. A third problem with restricting our behavior for environmental reasons is that, as in many areas of life, when we do something good, we allow ourselves to do something bad as a reward. This tendency is known as moral licensing. This pattern may be familiar to anyone who has struggled with dieting. If you're making good progress on your diet, you're much more likely to choose a chocolate bar over an apple as a snack than someone who is struggling with their diet. This effect is copiously documented when it comes to environmentally friendly behavior. People who have just donated to a charity are less likely to behave in an environmentally friendly way afterward. Those who have reduced their water consumption through an awareness campaign use more electricity instead. One study of shopping behavior shows that the more consumers purchase energy-saving light bulbs, use eco bags, or reuse their own bags, the more likely their weekly shopping is to contain meat and bottled water. I was once invited to participate in a debate with politicians and a journalist whom the BBC dubbed Ethical Man. This man had just spent 12 months documenting how he and his family had cut their carbon dioxide emissions. He insulated the house, sold the car, cut out meat, and even looked into ecological burials, although nobody died. In total, his family managed to cut emissions by around 20%, at a high personal and financial cost. What was most striking to me about Ethical Man was that when he finished his hard year's slog, to celebrate, he purchased tickets to take the whole family to South America, blowing his family's entire carbon dioxide savings. Vegetarianism has become a major subject in climate wars. The idea that if you care about the environment, you should eat less meat has become commonplace in the West, and vegetarianism is on the rise. Christiana Figueres, a global climate campaigner and former leader of the UN's climate change body, even suggested, how about restaurants in 10 to 15 years start treating carnivores in the way that smokers are treated? If they want to eat meat, they can do it outside the restaurant. I've been a vegetarian for ethical reasons since I was 11, and I believe everyone should make up their own minds about whether or not they eat meat. But we should be honest about what it will achieve. That's especially true because going vegetarian is actually quite difficult. One large U.S. survey shows that 84% of people who decide to become vegetarians end up failing, with most failing within a year. At a global level, of course, exhorting everyone to become vegetarian is callously ethnocentric. Right now, the world has 1.5 billion vegetarians, but only 75 million like me are vegetarians by choice. Most are vegetarians because they just can't afford meat, and as they move out of poverty, they will likely eat more and more meat. But if you actually stopped eating meat, how much would you achieve? Campaigners for climate-friendly diets rely on cherry-picked factoids to make the effects sound impressive. Many credulous news outlets suggest that eliminating meat from your diet can reduce your personal carbon emissions by 50% or more. That's massive, but also massively misleading. This level of reduction is achieved only by people who go entirely vegan. That means completely avoiding all animal products, including not just meat, but milk, eggs, honey, poultry, seafood, fur, leather, wool, and gelatin. It is suggested by other news outlets that vegetarians achieve about half this figure. Regardless, the numbers remain massive exaggerations. Vegans don't eliminate 50% of their personal emissions, and vegetarians don't cut 20 to 35% of theirs. They cut only that percentage of their food-related emissions, and food-related emissions represent only a small fraction of an individual's total emissions. A thorough, systematic analysis shows that eliminating meat from your diet will reduce your personal emissions by the equivalent of 1,191 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. For the average person in the industrialized world, that means an emissions cut of just 4.3%. We have gone from the claims of a 50% cut in emissions all the way to less than 1/10 of that. But there's more, because we need to allow for the rebound effect. Vegetarian diets are slightly cheaper. In the United States, vegetarians save about 7%. In Sweden, about 10%, and in the UK, about 15% of their food budgets. Spending that extra money on other goods and services means the rebound effect likely cuts around half of the saved carbon emissions accrued from going vegetarian. So if you're living in a rich country, going entirely vegetarian for the rest of your life will reduce your total personal emissions by about 2%. You could achieve a similar emissions reduction by eating anything you wanted and paying $1.50 each year on the RGGI trading system. Trying to save the world by giving up meat or unplugging our cell phones is ultimately misguided, and it distracts us from doing things that could make a real difference. If we want to improve the carbon efficiency of our food supply, one obvious approach would be to spend more on research and development for artificial meat. If this could be as good as the real stuff, some would say we're already there, There are huge opportunities to cut emissions. Artificial meat generates up to 96% fewer greenhouse gases than conventionally produced meat. A perfect meat substitute would be an obvious win because it doesn't require people to give up something they like. People could continue to enjoy their meat, but with just 4% of the emissions, and I would be able to eat burgers again. Electric cars are marketed as another great way to reduce carbon emissions, but most drivers are reluctant to switch because electric cars are substantially more expensive, and the need for recharging leads to range anxiety. Can I make it to the next charging station? That is why across the United States and around the world, lavish subsidies are the norm. When governments removed this support, for instance, in Denmark and Hong Kong, sales plummeted to nearly nothing. Replacing your current car with an electric car won't lead to dramatic emissions cuts, alas. The International Energy Agency makes a comparison between a standard gasoline-powered car and an electric one. The gasoline-powered car emits 34 tons of carbon dioxide over its 10-year lifetime, including production and disposal. At first glance, an electric car would seem to eliminate all the emissions. They are certainly sold as having zero emissions, but that is true only while it is being driven. Yet in many parts of the world, electric cars are reliant on electricity largely produced from fossil fuels, and their production is also more energy intensive than that of a gasoline-powered car, especially the battery. Since this production is typically reliant on fossil fuels, an electric car is actually responsible for lots of carbon dioxide emissions over its lifetime. Across the world, an electric car with a reasonably long range will, on average, emit 26 tons over its lifetime. So, switching from a gasoline-powered car emitting 34 tons of carbon dioxide to a comparable electric car that emits 26 tons doesn't eliminate emissions, it cuts them by 24%, leaving more than 3/4 in place. Emissions, of course, aren't the only cause of damage caused by driving. Driving creates lots of problems, ranging from noise pollution to lethal accidents. Figure 6.1 shows the European Union's latest estimate of the cost of all damages caused by driving, which is calculated to be almost 20 cents for every mile driven. Figure 6.1. Damage costs of driving a gasoline-powered car 1 mile per person. Notice the climate impact is likely vastly exaggerated. Notice that climate damages are a small part of the total damages. Of course, the electric car will be a bit better than a standard car on this measure. Electric cars also make less noise, which is about 5% of the total damage caused by driving, but nevertheless a measure on which electric cars outperform standard ones. Air pollution has an impact of 6%, and surprisingly, more electric cars can mean more air pollution. If you have plenty of hydropower, as in Norway, replacing gasoline with electric power can improve air quality. But in places with significant coal-powered electricity generation, including parts of the United States, more electric cars mean more air pollution. China, the world's biggest electric car market, has so many coal-powered plants that electric cars worsen local air with lethal consequences. It is estimated that in Shanghai, pollution from an additional 1 million electric-powered vehicles would kill nearly 3 times as many people annually as an additional 1 million gasoline-powered cars. Powered cars. But pollution isn't the most significant cost when it comes to cars. About 80% of the damage cars cause overall comes from accidents and congestion. For these effects, it makes no difference if a driver is in a Tesla or a BMW. All of which is to say that buying or subsidizing electric cars doesn't help with the biggest social problems with cars, and it is certainly not a good investment from a climate standpoint. Look at the costs we pay. The average subsidy spent on electric cars globally is about $10,000 per car. Each car saves 8 tons of carbon dioxide over its lifetime, a reduction you could buy on the RGGI market for just $48. And the impact will be minimal. The International Energy Agency hopes we can reach 130 million electric cars by 2030, a breathtaking expectation given that we have spent decades and billions of dollars in subsidies to reach just 5 million. Even if we could do that, it would cut a trifling 0.4% of global emissions by 2030. Electric cars will be part of our future solution to transport needs, but they are not about to solve climate change. Airplanes have become another battleground in the climate wars. Because of the large carbon footprint of air travel, environmental groups are increasingly pushing to make us feel flight shame, guilt for the carbon emissions we produce anytime we fly. This is a troubling movement. There has been a tremendous democratization of air travel in recent decades. Whereas flying was for many years the preserve of the ultra-rich, now most people in developed countries have the opportunity to travel. But the vast majority of people on the planet have still never taken a single flight. At least 80% according to Boeing. In India, where some 150 million people live in poverty, only 2% of the population has ever boarded an aircraft. Flights are not only for leisure. They allow the flow of expertise and labor, let us solve medical emergencies, provide disaster relief, help us to learn about other cultures, and connect us with loved ones. Even if we were willing to sacrifice all these things, staying off airplanes would not have the dramatic impact on climate change we might imagine. Even if every single one of the 4.5 billion people getting on any flight this year stayed on the ground, and the same happened every year until 2100, the rise in temperature would be reduced by just 0.05 degrees Fahrenheit, equivalent to delaying climate change by less than 1 year by 2100. What's more, at a personal level, there's a huge rebound effect. Researchers found that about 22% of the climate change benefits from canceling a personal holiday flight are undone because the saved money is spent on activities that create emissions. And the rebound effect from canceling a business flight is 159%, meaning that the climate impact actually increases with each canceled flight. The rebound effect has much more dramatic implications for a business class seat because the ticket is so much more expensive, while the carbon footprint is only slightly higher than in the cheaper cabins. Thinking of saving emissions by taking a cruise? Sorry, there is evidence that cruise ships are more environmentally damaging than planes. Instead of telling people not to fly on airplanes, we should focus on the carbon efficiency of those airplanes. Adaptation is already occurring. Each new generation of aircraft is, on average, 20% more fuel efficient than the model it replaces. Over the next decade, airlines will invest $1.3 trillion in new planes. Research is also underway on creating more sustainable fuels, including those produced by domestic and industrial waste. The overall carbon footprint of sustainable fuels is up to 80% less than that of today's aviation fuel, and testing started on using such fuels on commercial aircrafts in 2008. Billions are being spent, too, on exploring technologies like more aerodynamic wings, advanced and lighter plane structures, more efficient engines, and new aircraft configurations. And the International Air Transport Association, which represents airlines, estimates that better route management could cut CO2 emissions by 10%. Every dollar we can spend as a society on research and development to bring forward the moment of carbon dioxide neutral flights will be far more meaningful and more effective in addressing climate change than a few of us trying to cut a few flights out of a misplaced sense of shame. What else should we give up for the sake of the environment? Children, of course. A chorus of campaigners, scientists, and journalists have suggested that for the sake of Mother Earth, people should stop reproducing. The Guardian directs readers, want to fight climate change? Have fewer children. The New York Times warns that having a child is the worst environmental action possible. A hypothetical American woman might switch to a fuel-efficient car, drive less, recycle, install efficient light bulbs and energy-saving windows, but the newspaper says that by having 2 children, she will wreak damage nearly 40 times what she had saved by those actions. Such exhortations are not new. In the 1970s, American activists founded the National Organization for Non-Parents, promoting childlessness as a politically responsible choice because they believed the world was collapsing due to environmental ruin. I think it's a morally bankrupt and intrusive argument. Environmentalists have no place telling people that they should not become parents. And what's more, their counting doesn't even add up. The problem with research on the climate consequences of having children is that it's based on a deeply bizarre way of measuring these consequences. The most cited research paper, published in 2009, measures the climate impact of children by holding each parent responsible for half of every child's projected emissions over the entire duration of the child's life. Fine so far, but they do not stop there. A parent is held responsible not just for half of their child's emissions, but also for a quarter of their grandchildren's emissions, an eighth of their great-grandchildren's emissions, and so on. Moreover, the researchers estimate that each of these future children will emit 20 tons of carbon dioxide every year throughout their lives. This is a very odd approach. First off, the emissions expected in decades to come are estimated at an old, too high emissions rate for the United States. It has already declined to 20%. Moreover, official expectations are actually that per-person emissions will drop a further 0.5% every year before 2050, as research pays off and more of our daily activities become slightly more carbon efficient. But by far the biggest issue is that blaming a parent for emissions of all future generations is ludicrous. By this measure, our hunter-gatherer ancestors were far worse for the planet than any jet-setting billionaire today. Measured in reasonable terms, having a child means taking responsibility for putting into the world a new human who will produce about 90 years of carbon emissions. Whether your child, when she grows up, decides to have children of her own must be her choice. Thus, the total impact of having a child is at worst about 15 tons of carbon dioxide every year for her life, about 90 years. That is 1,350 tons. If you feel guilty about having a child, you could compensate for those carbon emissions by purchasing $8,100 worth of authorizations from RGGI. The broader approach, telling people not to reproduce, is preposterous. For the vast majority of people throughout history, children have provided the meaning and happiness that make life worth living. Children cost us in all sorts of ways: missed sleep, emotional havoc, college tuition, and yes, carbon emissions. And yet people keep having them because the benefits are so much greater than the costs. The next time you read about actions that you should take to help the planet, consider if it is just another case of, if everyone does a little, we'll achieve only a little. The truth is that most of our personal actions have only a tiny impact. Let me be clear. I'm not saying you shouldn't think carefully about your own personal choices. There are solid reasons why any of us might choose to change our diets, drive a smaller car, and reduce the carbon footprint we leave on the planet. But climate change shouldn't be the major consideration, because the effect of such choices is so limited. Much as we may wish otherwise, personal actions are not going to fix climate change. So let us turn next to the actions made by governments that actually could make a big difference. Carbon-cutting policies and international agreements. Why aren't those working either?